The sound of Vernon's laughter echoed through the marble courthouse hallway like nails on a chalkboard. There he was, my husband of 42 years, leaning against the wall with that woman, Celestine Brooks, whispering something that made her throw her head back and cackle like a hyena. When his eyes met mine across that cold, sterile hallway, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, he wrapped his arm around her waist tighter, pulled her closer, and smiled at me like I was nothing more than yesterday's trash. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The weight of my purse felt heavy in my trembling hands, but what was inside that purse felt even heavier. They had no idea what was coming. Vernon thought he was so smart, thought he had outplayed me in every way possible. But the good Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the meek really do inherit the earth. "Dolores, you ready for this?" My lawyer, Reginald Tucker, appeared at my elbow, his dark suit crisp and his briefcase gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes held a confidence that I desperately needed to borrow. "I've been ready," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the bustling courthouse noise. "The question is, are they ready for what I got?" Before we continue, please drop a comment if you've ever experienced something like this. We'd love to hear your story, and subscribe to the channel to help us grow. 3 months ago, I thought Vernon and I would be spending our golden years traveling in the RV we'd been saving for, visiting our grandchildren, and sitting on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands 30 years ago. 3 months ago, I was Dolores Washington, devoted wife, mother of 2, grandmother of 5, and faithful member of Mount Olive Baptist Church. 3 months ago, I was a fool. It started with little things that I should have noticed, but didn't want to see. Vernon working late at the auto shop more often, saying Mr. Henderson needed him to close up. New cologne that smelled like expensive department store counters instead of the Old Spice he'd worn since 1982. Phone calls that he'd take outside, claiming it was just business. And then there were the credit card statements. I found them by accident, stuffed behind the coffee maker where Vernon thought I'd never look. Purchases I didn't recognize, jewelry from Zales. Dinners at restaurants we'd never been to, hotel rooms in downtown Atlanta when he was supposedly working overtime. My hands shook so hard I could barely read the tiny print. But there it was in black and white. Proof that my husband was living a double life. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening. Vernon came home smelling like that strange perfume again, and I was sitting at our kitchen table with those statements spread out like evidence at a crime scene. The look on his face when he saw them told me everything I needed to know, but I asked anyway. "Who is she, Vernon?" He didn't even try to deny it. Just loosened his tie, grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, and sat down across from me like we were discussing the weather. "Her name's Celestine. We work together." "Work together doing what?" "Last I checked, there weren't any women mechanics at Henderson's shop. She handles the books now. Mr. Henderson hired her 6 months ago." Vernon took a long sip of his beer, avoiding my eyes. "Look, Dee, I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." "It just did?" My voice cracked like I was 15 again instead of 68. 42 years of marriage just doesn't matter because it just happened? "Don't be dramatic. You knew things between us hadn't been the same since your mama passed. You've been different, distant. Celestine understands me." The casual way he said it, like our marriage was a business transaction that had simply expired, made something inside me snap. I stood up so fast the chair scraped against the linoleum floor. "Different? Distant? I was grieving, Vernon. My mother died, and instead of supporting your wife, you went and found yourself a replacement." "She's not a replacement. She's—" He paused, and for a moment I thought he might show some remorse. Instead, he finished his beer and looked me dead in the eye. "She's everything you used to be before you got old and bitter." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered backward, gripping the counter to keep from falling. In 42 years, Vernon had never spoken to me with such cruelty. This wasn't the man who held my hand through 3 miscarriages before we had Kamari and Zendaya. This wasn't the man who worked 2 jobs to put me through nursing school. This was a stranger wearing my husband's face. "Get out," I whispered. "What?" "I said get out of my house." "Our house, Dee, and I'm not going anywhere. If anybody's leaving, it's you." That's when I learned about the papers he'd already filed. Divorce papers that painted me as an unstable woman going through a mental breakdown after my mother's death. Papers that claimed I was financially irresponsible and emotionally unstable. Papers that requested he keep the house, the car, and most of our savings because I was unfit to handle major financial decisions. The worst part wasn't even Vernon's betrayal. The worst part was finding out that my own children, my babies that I'd carried for 9 months each, nursed through every fever, cheered at every graduation, had chosen their father's side. Kamari, my 35-year-old son who worked as an accountant and lived in a fancy suburb 20 minutes away, came by the next evening. I thought he was coming to check on me, to offer support during the worst crisis of my life. Instead, he sat in my living room and delivered the news like he was reading a grocery list. "Mama, Daddy told us what's been going on, about how you've been acting since Grandmama died." "Acting how, Kamari? Grieving? Missing my mother?" "You know that's not what I mean. The paranoia, the accusations, going through his personal things." Kamari straightened his tie, a gesture that reminded me painfully of his father. "Maybe some time apart would be good for both of you." "Time apart? Kamari, your father is having an affair." "Daddy's found someone who makes him happy again. You can't fault him for that." I stared at my son, my firstborn, the child I'd rocked to sleep every night until he was 3 years old, and realized I was looking at a stranger. When had he become so cold? When had he stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to his father's happiness? And what about my happiness? What about 42 years of marriage? What about the vows we took before God? "Mama, you're being dramatic. Daddy's not asking for much. Just the house and his fair share of the assets. You'll get alimony, and there's that little apartment complex on Riverside that would be perfect for you." "Little apartment complex?" My voice rose to a pitch I didn't recognize. "Kamari, this is my home. I picked out every piece of furniture, planted every flower in that garden, scrubbed every inch of these floors. And now it's time to downsize. Besides, Celestine has some great ideas for redecorating." That's when I knew I was truly alone. My own son had already accepted this woman as my replacement, had already imagined her living in my house, sleeping in my bed, cooking in my kitchen. Zendaya's visit 2 days later was even worse. My daughter, my baby girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, arrived with her 2 youngest children in tow. I thought maybe she was bringing my grandchildren to cheer me up. Instead, she was bringing them to say goodbye. "Mama, we think it's best if the kids don't get caught in the middle of this mess," Zendaya announced, not even bothering to sit down. She stood in my living room like she couldn't wait to leave. "What mess?" "There's no mess on my part. Your father's the one who's trying to start over with someone who actually appreciates him." Zendaya's words cut deep, but her tone cut deeper. She spoke to me like I was a problematic child instead of the woman who'd raised her. "Look, Mama, I know you're hurt, but you have to understand where he's coming from. Celestine is good for him. She makes him laugh again." "I used to make him laugh." "Used to." Past tense. People change, Mama. People grow apart. At least Daddy's being honest about it instead of just going through the motions. I watched my daughter gather up my grandchildren, little Destiny and Marcus, who I babysat every Tuesday and Thursday, and realized they'd been coached. They barely looked at me, barely said goodbye. Zendaya had already poisoned them against me. "When's the last time you did something nice for Daddy?" Zendaya continued. "When's the last time you dressed up for him, or cooked his favorite meal, or even smiled when he came home?" "I was grieving your grandmother." "For 6 months, Mama. At some point, grief becomes an excuse." After they left, I sat in my empty house and cried until I had no tears left. Then I got angry. Then I got smart. That's when I called Inez, my best friend since high school and the most resourceful woman I knew. Inez had been through her own divorce 20 years earlier, and she'd learned some things about men and money that would have made my Sunday school teacher blush. "Girl, you cannot let them railroad you like this," Inez said, settling into my kitchen chair with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Now, you said Vernon thinks he's got all the cards, right? Well, honey, I got news for you. Men like Vernon always leave a trail, and that trail always leads back to their own downfall." That's when Inez told me about her nephew Jerome, who worked as a private investigator specializing in adultery cases. For 3 weeks, Jerome followed Vernon and Celestine, documenting everything: where they went, what they bought, how often they met, and most importantly, where the money was coming from. What Jerome found was better than Christmas morning. Vernon hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been systematically moving our assets into accounts that Celestine had access to. Money from our retirement fund, proceeds from the sale of Vernon's classic car collection that he'd claimed was stolen, even the inheritance from my mother's estate that was supposed to be mine alone. But the real bombshell was in the photographs Jerome had taken outside a small house on the east side of town. Vernon emerging from that house with a little girl who looked to be about 8 years old. A little girl who had his eyes, his nose, and his stubborn chin. A little girl who called him Daddy when he picked her up and spun her around in the front yard. Celestine Brooks hadn't just stolen my husband. She'd given him the child that he'd apparently wanted more than the family he already had. And for 3 years, they'd been playing house with my money. "You got him now," Inez whispered as we spread the photographs across my kitchen table. "You got him dead to rights." Standing in that courthouse hallway, watching Vernon whisper sweet nothings to his mistress, while my own children treated me like a stranger, I touched my purse where those photographs weighted like loaded bullets. Vernon thought he was about to get everything he wanted. He thought he'd successfully painted me as the crazy ex-wife who couldn't let go. He had no idea that in 20 minutes, when we walked into that courtroom, I was about to blow up his entire world. "Mrs. Washington?" The bailiff appeared at my shoulder. "Judge Morrison is ready for you." I straightened my shoulders, smoothed down my best church dress, and followed Reginald toward the courtroom doors. Behind me, I heard Vernon's confident laughter one more time, and I smiled. He wouldn't be laughing much longer. But as we reached the courtroom entrance, my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. It was from Kamari. "Mama, there's something about Celestine that Daddy doesn't know. Meet me at Riverside Park after court. Come alone. And whatever you do, don't trust your lawyer." I looked up at Reginald, who was holding the door open for me with a smile that suddenly seemed too wide, too eager. My heart started racing as I realized that everything I thought I knew about this case might be wrong. And as we walked into that courtroom where Vernon was already seated next to Celestine, both of them grinning like they'd already won, I saw someone else sitting in the back row. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who was supposed to be 3 states away in nursing school. My daughter-in-law, Kendra, Kamari's ex-wife who'd disappeared with their son 2 years ago. She caught my eye and mouthed a single word that made my knees go weak. "Run." "Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw her previous statements and accept the settlement terms as proposed by Mr. Washington's counsel." The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I stared at Reginald Tucker in complete shock as he stood before Judge Morrison. My supposedly trusted lawyer just threw my entire case into the garbage. Around me, the courtroom seemed to spin as Vernon's victorious grin spread across his face like spilled oil. "What?" I whispered, gripping the wooden rail so hard my knuckles went white. "Reginald, what are you doing?" But he didn't even look at me, just continued addressing the judge like I wasn't sitting right behind him, like I wasn't the woman who'd paid him $5,000 to represent me in this divorce. "Mrs. Washington has reconsidered her position regarding the asset division and custody of marital property. She acknowledges that her recent emotional state may have clouded her judgment regarding the accusations against Mr. Washington. No! I shot to my feet, my voice echoing through the courtroom. Your Honor, that's not true. I never said any of that. Judge Morrison, a stern black woman in her 50s who I'd hoped might understand my situation, looked at me over her reading glasses. Mrs. Washington, please allow your counsel to speak for you. But he's not speaking for me. He's lying! The desperation in my voice was so raw it hurt my own ears. Your Honor, I have evidence. Financial records, photographs, proof that my husband has been stealing from our joint accounts. Your Honor, Reginald interjected smoothly, pulling out a manila folder I'd never seen before. I have here a psychiatric evaluation showing that Mrs. Washington has been experiencing severe depression and paranoid episodes since her mother's death. These alleged evidence she speaks of are products of her deteriorated mental state. The courtroom felt like it was closing in around me. Every face stared at me with mixtures of pity and disgust, like I was some crazy old woman having a breakdown. In the front row, Vernon and Celestine exchanged satisfied glances, and I saw Celestine squeeze Vernon's hand in a gesture of shared victory. Furthermore, Reginald continued, Mrs. Washington's own children have expressed concerns about her ability to make rational decisions regarding her future. They support their father's request for full control of marital assets, with appropriate alimony arrangements for their mother's care. You're a liar, I screamed, pointing at Reginald with a trembling finger. You work for me. I hired you. Mrs. Washington. Judge Morrison's voice carried a warning tone. You need to control yourself or I'll have you removed from my courtroom. That's when I understood what was happening. This whole thing was a setup. Reginald had never been working for me. He'd been working for Vernon from the beginning. Every document I'd given him, every piece of evidence I'd shared, every strategy we'd discussed had been handed directly to my husband's legal team. Your Honor, may I approach? Vernon's lawyer, a slick white man in an expensive suit, stood up with his own folder. You may. As the two lawyers whispered with the judge, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Kendra, my former daughter-in-law, sliding into the seat beside me. She was thinner than I remembered, with new lines around her eyes that made her look older than her 32 years. Don't say anything, she whispered urgently. Just nod and act like you're accepting this. Trust me. Kendra, what are you doing here? Where's my grandson? Where's Jordan? Safe. But you won't be if you don't listen to me. Her grip on my arm was almost painful. They're watching everything you do, Dolores. Everything you say. Just take the settlement and walk out of here. I can't! This house is all I have left. These are my life savings. Your life savings are already gone, Kendra said flatly. This whole court proceeding is just theater. They've been moving your money for months, and if you fight this in court, you'll lose everything and end up in a psychiatric facility. Before I could process what she was saying, Judge Morrison called for order. After reviewing the documentation provided by both parties, I'm approving the settlement as agreed upon by Mrs. Washington's counsel. Mr. Washington will retain primary residence and ownership of all marital property, including the family home, vehicles, and retirement accounts. Mrs. Washington will receive monthly alimony payments of $800 and may remain in the family home for 30 days to collect her personal belongings. $800. After 42 years of marriage, 30 years of working as a registered nurse, and building a life with my own hands, I was being reduced to $800 a month. Vernon stood up and shook his lawyer's hand, then turned to embrace Celestine right there in front of everyone. She kissed him like they were teenagers, and the sound of their laughter followed me as Kendra pulled me toward the exit. Come on, she said. We need to talk, and we can't do it here. Outside the courthouse, the October air cut through my thin dress like ice water. I stood on those marble steps, feeling more lost than I'd ever felt in my life, watching Vernon and Celestine pose for pictures that Kamari was taking with his phone. My own son was documenting my humiliation like it was a celebration. Mama! Zendaya approached with fake sympathy painted across her face. See? That wasn't so bad. Now you can start fresh. Maybe find a nice little apartment. Join some senior groups. You'll make new friends. New friends? I stared at my daughter in disbelief. Zendaya, they just stole everything I've worked for my entire life, and you're talking about making friends? Don't be so dramatic. Daddy's being generous with the alimony. $800 goes pretty far when you're living alone. $800 doesn't even cover rent in this city. Then maybe it's time to move somewhere cheaper, Vernon said, appearing beside his daughter with Celestine hanging on his arm like expensive jewelry. There are some nice retirement communities about an hour outside the city. Very affordable. I looked at this man I'd loved for over 4 decades and realized I was looking at a complete stranger. Where was the Vernon who'd held me when I cried about not being able to have more children? Where was the man who'd driven me to night school and waited in the parking lot every evening for 2 years while I finished my nursing degree? Vernon, how could you do this to me? How could you throw away everything we built together? What we built? He laughed, and the sound was colder than the October wind. Dee, what we built was me working my ass off while you complained about everything. What we built was me putting up with your moods, your mother's interference, and your constant criticism. What Celestine and I are building is actually based on love and respect. Love and respect? My voice cracked. I gave you my entire life. And I gave you mine. Now we're even. Vernon looked at his watch like this conversation was keeping him from something important. You've got 30 days to get your things and get out. Don't make this harder than it has to be. They walked away together. Vernon, Celestine, Kamari, and Zendaya, like a new family unit that had no space for me. I watched them pile into Vernon's truck, the truck I'd made payments on for 3 years when money was tight, and drive away from the courthouse that had just made me homeless. Ready to hear the truth? Kendra asked, appearing at my elbow again. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in Kendra's rental car in the parking lot of a Waffle House 3 miles from the courthouse. She'd ordered us both coffee, but mine sat untouched as she opened a laptop computer and showed me bank statements that made my blood run cold. This started 18 months ago, Kendra explained, scrolling through screen after screen of financial records. Small transfers at first, just a few hundred here and there, but look at this. She pointed to a series of withdrawals from our joint savings account, each one for exactly $999. Just under the $1,000 threshold that would require my signature. Vernon's been bleeding you dry systematically. But here's the thing, Dolores. He didn't figure this out on his own. Someone taught him how to do this. Someone with access to banking systems and legal knowledge. Who? Kendra clicked to another screen, showing a series of emails between Vernon and someone called R.J. Tucker Legal Services. Your lawyer. Reginald Tucker has been working with Vernon for over a year, planning this entire divorce. They've been moving your money into offshore accounts, setting up shell companies, even taking out loans against your house. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. But why would Reginald do that? I hired him. I paid him. You paid him $5,000. Vernon and Celestine paid him $50,000. Plus a percentage of everything they steal from you. The magnitude of the betrayal was overwhelming. It wasn't just my husband who decided I was worthless. It was my lawyer, my children, and apparently half the people I'd trusted with my life. There's more, Kendra said, pulling up a folder of photographs. Remember that house on the east side where you saw Vernon with the little girl? His daughter with Celestine. No. That's not Celestine's house, and that's not her daughter. Kendra zoomed in on one of the photos. That's Sherry Matthews' house. Sherry is Vernon's other girlfriend. The little girl is his daughter with her. I felt like I might throw up. Other girlfriend? Vernon's been running 3 relationships simultaneously for the past 4 years. You, Celestine, and Sherry. He's promised to marry both Celestine and Sherry after your divorce is final. He's even bought engagement rings for both of them. The coffee cup slipped from my trembling hands, spilling brown liquid across the car's interior. Vernon wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a professional con man who'd been systematically destroying women's lives. But here's what he doesn't know, Kendra continued, pulling up another file. Celestine Brooks isn't who she says she is. Her real name is Crystal Baltimore, and she's got warrants out for identity theft in 3 states. She's been using stolen Social Security numbers to open credit accounts, and she's done this exact same scam to at least 6 other men in the past 5 years. You mean, I mean Vernon thinks he's the predator, but he's actually the prey.
Celestine is going to take everything he stole from you, plus everything he saved over his lifetime, and then disappear, probably sometime in the next 30 days. Before I could respond, Kendra's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID and her face went pale. We have to go. Now. What's wrong? That was my contact at the police department. Vernon just reported you for making terroristic threats against his family. There's a warrant being issued for your arrest. What? I never threatened anyone. Doesn't matter. Reginald probably recorded your outburst in the courtroom and edited it to sound threatening. They're going to use this to have you committed for psychological evaluation, which will give them legal control over any remaining assets you might have hidden. We drove toward my house in tense silence, Kendra checking her rearview mirror every few seconds like we were being followed. When we turned onto my street, she cursed under her breath. Too late. 3 police cars were parked in my driveway, their red and blue lights painting my house in alternating colors of emergency. Officers were loading boxes into their trunks, boxes that contained 42 years of my life. They're cleaning you out, Kendra said. By the time those 30 days are up, there won't be anything left for you to pack. That's when I saw him. Kamari was standing on my front porch, directing the officers toward specific rooms, pointing out items like he was conducting an auction of my belongings. My own son was helping them steal the last remnants of my life. I have to stop this, I said, reaching for the car door handle. You can't. The minute you set foot on that property, they'll arrest you. Then you'll disappear into the system and no one will ever see you again. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let them take everything? Kendra turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Part determination, part fear, part something that looked almost like hunger. You're going to help me bring down everyone involved in this conspiracy. Vernon, Celestine, Reginald, and the person who's been orchestrating this entire operation from behind the scenes. What person? The person who taught them how to steal your money without leaving a paper trail. The person who's been running this con game for years, using lawyers like Reginald to identify vulnerable women and systematically destroy their lives. Kendra's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Your own daughter, Zendaya. She's been the mastermind behind all of it. I stared at Kendra in shock. That's impossible. Zendaya's my baby. She would never... Zendaya's been running a network of divorce fraud for the past 3 years. She identifies women like you through her job at the credit union, women with substantial assets and family problems. Then she connects them with men like Vernon, who are willing to destroy their own wives for money. She takes a cut of everything they steal. No, that can't be true. She's the one who introduced Vernon to Celestine in the first place. She's the one who recommended Reginald as your lawyer. She's probably the one who convinced your grandchildren to stop visiting you. Kendra pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. Look. The messages were between Zendaya and someone called Crystal B., Celestine's real name. They discussed strategy for isolating me from my support system, timeline for moving my assets, and even specific phrases to use to make me seem unstable. In the last message, sent just 2 hours ago, Zendaya had written, "Old lady's taken care of. Should be committed by tonight. Transfer the rest tomorrow." My daughter, my baby girl who I'd protected and nurtured and sacrificed for, had been orchestrating my destruction from the very beginning. As I sat in that car watching police officers carry my belongings out of my house, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and my life had been a carefully constructed lie. Vernon wasn't just a cheating husband, he was a puppet in a much larger scheme designed to destroy women like me. And my own daughter was pulling the strings. "So what do we do now?" I whispered. Kendra smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something that looked like hope. "Now we make them all pay. But first, I need you to understand something, Dolores. I'm not doing this just to help you. I'm doing this because they destroyed my family too, and I want my son back. Are you willing to risk everything to get your life back?" I looked at my house one last time, watching Kamari direct the systematic dismantling of everything I'd ever cared about. "I've already lost everything," I said. "Let's burn it all down." But as we drove away, I saw someone else standing in the shadows across the street, watching the entire scene with binoculars. Someone who shouldn't have known about any of this. Someone who was supposed to be dead. My mother. The woman standing across the street from my house looked exactly like my mother, down to the way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right from years of carrying heavy nursing bags. But my mother was dead. I'd held her hand as she took her last breath 6 months ago. I'd planned her funeral, picked out her casket, and thrown dirt on her grave. "That's impossible," I whispered, pressing my face against Kendra's car window. "Mama's gone." "Is she?" Kendra accelerated away from my neighborhood, checking her mirrors constantly. "Dolores, what if I told you that everything you think happened 6 months ago was staged?" "Staged how?" "I watched my mother die." "You watched someone who looked like your mother die, someone who was already terminal, someone who was paid to play a role in the final months of her life." Kendra's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "Your real mother has been in hiding, gathering evidence about what Zendaya was planning to do to you." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "That's insane! You're talking about something out of a movie." "Check your phone. Text from an unknown number sent about 10 minutes ago." I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers. There was indeed a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Baby girl, Mama's coming home. Meet me at Mount Olive at midnight. Come alone and bring Kendra. We got work to do. M.W. M.W. Margaret Washington. My mother's initials." "How is this possible?" "Your mother never trusted Zendaya's sudden interest in your finances. When Zendaya started asking questions about your assets, your mother hired her own private investigator to look into your daughter's activities. What she found was horrifying." Kendra pulled into the parking lot of Mount Olive Baptist Church, the sanctuary where I'd attended services for over 30 years. Even in the darkness, the familiar white steeple and red brick walls felt like home in a way that my own house no longer did. Zendaya's been running this scam for years, targeting elderly women through her job at the credit union. She identifies women with substantial assets and troubled marriages, then orchestrates their destruction from the inside. Your mother found evidence of at least 12 other women who've been victimized the same way you were. And she faked her own death to protect me? She faked her death to protect the investigation. If Zendaya had known your mother was onto her, she would have escalated the timeline. You would have been declared mentally incompetent months ago, and all your assets would already be gone. The church doors opened, and a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was my mother, alive and moving with more energy than I'd seen from her in years. Behind her walked Pastor Williams, along with 3 people I didn't recognize, 2 women and a man, all carrying briefcases and recording equipment. "Dolores!" Mama called out, her voice carrying across the parking lot like a bell. "Come here, baby. We got some righteous anger to unleash." The reunion was surreal. My mother felt solid and warm in my arms, smelling like the lavender lotion she'd used for as long as I could remember. But her embrace also felt different, stronger, more determined, like she'd been preparing for battle. "Mama, I don't understand any of this." "You will. Come inside. We got a lot of ground to cover before morning."
Inside Mount Olive's Fellowship Hall, the three strangers introduced themselves as FBI agents specializing in financial fraud. Agent Rodriguez, Agent Chen, and Agent Thompson had been working with my mother for the past 4 months, building a federal case against what they called the Washington family conspiracy. Mrs. Washington, the senior Mrs. Washington, Agent Rodriguez clarified, contacted us when she discovered that her daughter was using her position at First National Credit Union to target vulnerable women for systematic financial exploitation. The scheme works like this, Agent Chen explained, spreading photographs and documents across the Fellowship Hall tables. Zendaya identifies women going through life transitions, deaths in the family, health crises, marital problems. She accesses their credit reports and financial records through her job, then creates detailed profiles of their assets and vulnerabilities. Then she introduces chaos into their lives, Agent Thompson continued. She arranges for their husbands to meet women like Crystal Baltimore, who specialize in seducing married men and convincing them to liquidate their assets for new starts with younger women. I stared at the evidence spread before me. Bank records, emails, recorded phone conversations, surveillance photographs. It was overwhelming and nauseating at the same time. Zendaya takes a 30% cut of everything stolen, my mother said, her voice harder than I'd ever heard it. She's made over $2 million in the past 3 years, destroying families and leaving women like you homeless and broken. But why me? Why her own mother? Because you had the most assets, Agent Rodriguez said bluntly. Your house, your retirement savings, Vernon's shop, the life insurance policies, Zendaya's cut from your destruction would have been her biggest payday yet. Pastor Williams, who'd been silent during this explanation, finally spoke up. Dolores, your mother came to me months ago when she first suspected something was wrong. We've been praying and planning, waiting for the right moment to expose this evil. And that moment is tomorrow morning, Mama said. Judge Morrison has agreed to hear new evidence in your divorce case. Evidence that will not only reverse today's ruling, but also result in criminal charges against everyone involved. What evidence? Agent Chen opened a laptop computer and turned the screen toward me. Recorded conversations between Zendaya and Crystal Baltimore discussing how to have you committed to a psychiatric facility. Financial records showing the systematic theft of your assets. And most importantly, testimony from 3 other victims who are ready to face their attackers in court. Over the next 6 hours, sitting in that church fellowship hall surrounded by my mother, Kendra, federal agents, and Pastor Williams, I learned the full scope of what had been done to me. It wasn't just betrayal. It was organized crime, with my own daughter as the ringleader. But we weren't just planning to expose them, we were planning to destroy them completely. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into Judge Morrison's courtroom wearing my best navy blue dress and carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would change everything. Vernon was already seated at his table with Celestine and his lawyer, all of them looking confident and relaxed. Zendaya sat in the front row, smiling like she was attending a graduation. None of them noticed the FBI agent sitting in the back row. Your Honor, my real lawyer, Agent Rodriguez, who is also a licensed attorney, stood and addressed the court. We're requesting an emergency hearing based on new evidence of criminal fraud and conspiracy. Vernon's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection. This case was settled yesterday. Mrs. Washington accepted the terms through her counsel. Mrs. Washington's previous counsel was part of the conspiracy we're exposing today, Agent Rodriguez replied calmly. Mr. Reginald Tucker has been arrested this morning on charges of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The courtroom erupted. Vernon spun around to stare at me with an expression of shock and growing panic. Celestine grabbed his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. In the gallery, Zendaya had gone completely pale. Furthermore, Agent Rodriguez continued, the woman sitting next to Mr. Washington is not Celestine Brooks. She is Crystal Baltimore, a wanted fugitive with outstanding warrants for identity theft in multiple states. 2 federal agents moved down the aisle toward Celestine, who jumped to her feet and tried to run. She made it exactly 3 steps before they had her in handcuffs. The sound of the metal clicking shut echoed through the silent courtroom like thunder. "Your Honor," Agent Rodriguez said as the agents led a struggling Crystal Baltimore toward the exit, "I'd like to present evidence showing that Mr. Washington has been the victim of an elaborate con game orchestrated by his own daughter, Ms. Zendaya Washington Porter." The next 2 hours were the most satisfying of my life. Agent after agent took the stand, presenting evidence of the conspiracy, bank records showing how my money had been systematically stolen, recordings of Zendaya coaching Crystal on how to manipulate Vernon, documentation of 12 other women who'd been victimized by the same scheme. Vernon sat at his table in stunned silence as the reality of his situation became clear. He hadn't been the predator. He'd been prey, manipulated by his own daughter into destroying his marriage so she could steal everything we'd built together. But the most devastating moment came when Agent Thompson played a recorded phone conversation between Zendaya and Crystal from 2 weeks ago. "The old lady's almost broken," Zendaya's voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. "Dad thinks this was all his idea, but I've been feeding him information for months. Once we get her committed, we can liquidate everything and disappear." "What about your father?" Crystal's voice asked. "What about him? He served his purpose. After we clean out his accounts, we'll frame him for elder abuse and let him rot in prison. He's too stupid to figure out what really happened." The sound that came from Vernon's throat wasn't quite human. He turned to stare at Zendaya, who was frantically whispering with a lawyer who'd appeared from nowhere. When their eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something break inside my husband of 42 years. Judge Morrison called for order, then delivered her ruling. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm immediately reversing yesterday's settlement. All assets are to be returned to their original accounts. Mr. Washington will retain his business and personal belongings, but the family home and all joint assets return to Mrs. Washington. Additionally, I'm issuing warrants for the arrest of Ms. Zendaya Washington Porter on charges of conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse." The federal agents moved toward Zendaya, who finally understood that her carefully constructed world was collapsing. She looked at me with an expression of pure hatred. "You stupid old woman! You don't understand what you've done. I was trying to secure your future. By stealing everything I owned? By making sure you didn't lose it to some nursing home when you get senile. At least this way, the money stayed in the family." Even as they handcuffed her, my daughter continued to justify her betrayal. She'd convinced herself that destroying my life was somehow an act of love. Vernon approached me as the courtroom cleared, his face gray with shock and shame. "Dee, I don't know what to say. I don't know how she got inside my head like that." "She's your daughter, Vernon. She learned manipulation from watching both of us. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at this man who'd been my husband, my partner, the father of my children. 3 days ago, I would have done anything to save our marriage. Now I felt only sadness for what we'd lost, and relief for what I'd gained. "I forgive you, Vernon, but I can't come back to you. Too much has been broken." "I understand." He handed me a set of keys, the keys to my house, my car, my life. "For what it's worth, Dee, I never stopped loving you. I just got lost somewhere along the way." 6 months later, I'm sitting on my front porch swing, the one Vernon built 30 years ago, watching my grandchildren play in the garden I replanted with my own hands. Kendra and her son Jordan live with me now, and the house feels full of life again. Vernon moved to a small apartment across town and goes to therapy twice a week. We're divorced, but we're learning to be friends again. He comes to Sunday dinner sometimes, and we talk about our grandchildren instead of our mistakes. Zendaya received 8 years in federal prison. Crystal Baltimore got 12 years. Reginald Tucker was disbarred and sentenced to 5 years. The FBI recovered most of my stolen money, and I donated half of the settlement to a fund for elderly fraud victims. My mother, My very much alive mother lives in the guest room and spends her days gardening and spoiling her great-grandchildren. She says faking her own death was the hardest thing she ever did, but watching her family heal has been worth every moment of pain. You know what I learned through all this? I asked her yesterday as we sat on the porch swing together. What's that, baby? Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones you trusted the most. But sometimes the people who save you are the ones you thought were gone forever. Mama squeezed my hand and smiled. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Dolores. Even when everything looks lost, He's got a plan. I looked out at my reclaimed life, my house, my garden, my family, my peace, and realized she was absolutely right. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.